Скажите, что меня видно и слышно, поставьте плюсик. Спасибо большое, Ирина. Мы начинаем наш вебинар, так называемый страноведческий, посвященный вопросам ведения бизнеса в других странах, куда релоцируются наши бизнесмены, открытие бизнеса, налогообложение, ну и вообще, каким образом его там строить, общие экономические вопросы. Таких вебинаров с 2022 года мы провели, наверное, уже около 30, посвященные разным странам. Сегодня мы добрались до Ирландии. А наш вебинар мы транслируем не только для аудитории в Украине, но также в Молдове, Эстонии и некоторых других странах СНГ, исключая Россию и Беларусь. Понимая, что в этих странах не все говорят на украинском языке, а наши спикеры сегодня, команда Crowe Ирландия, представленная Эйден Райаном и Майклом Оскеттелом, говорит по-английски. Я буду сопровождать их рассказ коротким переводом ключевых моментов на русский язык. Я Дмитрий Михайленко, руководитель офиса Crowe в Украине. Мы ценим ваши вопросы. Вы их можете писать в правом нижнем углу нашей вебинарной комнаты. Время от времени я их буду читать и возвращаться к спикерам. Будем их обсуждать по ходу дела. Я сейчас переведу это на английский для Эйдена и Майкла, и после этого передам им слово. Dear colleagues, we start our webinar dedicated to the issues of doing business in the other countries where our businesses are relocating to. From 2022, we arranged around 30 similar webinars dedicated to different countries. Today, it is my pleasure that we come up to Ireland and introduce you the team of Crowe Ireland. Currently, our speakers are Aidan Ryan and Michael Oskettel, the directors of Crowe Ireland. And as usual, we will discuss the overall issues of the economical environment, the issues how to set up the business in Ireland, principal corporate issues, and the issues of taxation, which you should know if you choose Ireland as your hub in doing business in the other countries. Our audience today, it is not only Ukrainian businesses, but the businessmen from Estonia, Moldova, and other countries of ex-CIS, excluding Russia and Belarus. Therefore, I will provide short translation of the main key issues of Aidan and Michael into Russian for your understanding the key ideas. We like your questions. You can put them into right down corner of the screen. From time to time, I will go to this screen and translate the questions to our speakers, and in such a way we will discuss the issues which are interesting to you. Maybe these are all principal organizational issues which I would speak before we can proceed. And Aidan and Michael, it is my pleasure that we can start our conversation around Ireland. The floor is yours. Please feel free to start your overview.
Thank you, Dmitro. So, as you mentioned, our agenda for today is going to cover three areas. The first and second one will be covered by myself, and the third will be covered by my colleague Michael. So, without further ado, let's move to the first agenda item, Ireland's economy. So, for those of you who may not be aware, Ireland is a small island nation on the edge of Western Europe. Most of the island, as you can see in orange here, is the Republic of Ireland. The area in grey to the top right hand side is Northern Ireland, which is part of the UK. The UK, as you may be aware, left the European Union in 2016. It's important to say that all of what we will be speaking about today will only relate to the Republic of Ireland. However, it is also worth noting that while they are separate jurisdictions, there is no hard border, meaning there is free movement of both people and goods between the two jurisdictions, and they can trade seamlessly with each other. Despite being part of the UK, Northern Ireland actually has a special status in the European Union single market in that it can trade with both the UK and the EU in a tariff-free and seamless manner. Moving back to the Republic of Ireland, I suppose it has been a well-established member of the European Union for well over 50 years now, and has been a member of the Eurozone single currency since 1999. So just to put that into context, there are, of the 27 EU member states, 20 of those have adopted the euro as their national currency. So, and this represents all the major European nations, around 350 million people. So, I mean, a key point for Ireland is that it is using the euro, and when it trades with the major nations of Europe, those foreign exchange risks are actually taken away in a lot of cases due to its membership of the euro. Another key point for Ireland to note is that with the UK's departure from the European Union in 2016, Ireland now remains the only principally English-speaking nation in the European Union. And this has become an important factor when companies globally have decided how best to enter and establish a presence in the European market. English being a second language in many, many countries around the world, it's seen as an easy way into the European market. Over to you, Dimitro.
Окей. Да, я коротко переведу. Значит, этот слайд содержит краткое изложение информации об Ирландии и истории ее вхождения в Евросоюз. То есть Эйден подчеркнул, что все-таки Ирландия делится на две части. Первая – это Северная Ирландия, часть UK, ну и вторая – это желто закрашенная часть, собственно, Республика Ирландия, о которой мы сегодня будем вести речь. А серенькая часть обладает довольно уникальным статусом. Мы помним, что UK вышла из Евросоюза, но Северная Ирландия сохранила возможность торговать как с UK, так и с Евросоюзом. А Ирландия же вообще в Евросоюзе осталась, более того, она в нем уже 50 лет, с 1973 года, и она также является частью еврозоны с 1999 года, в ней 5 миллионов человек живет, и английский является языком основного общения. Aidan, thank you so much. We can proceed.
Thank you. Okay. So when we talk about investing in Ireland and why it is an excellent place to do business, we talk about four key pillars. So we have a stable environment, and what this means is that we are not prone to drastic fundamental legislative or operational change. So this gives businesses a very strong level of certainty that when they invest and establish themselves here, the conditions will not change to an extent where they can no longer operate. And this gives them confidence that their money in 10 years' time or 15 years' time won't be wasted because of a government decision or regulatory decision. We have a stable environment, okay? Our track record. So when I talk about our track record, I really speak about our economy, and it's sort of linked to the stable environment also, but our economy is very, very well managed. We consistently, outperform or match European averages when it comes to inflation, when it comes to economic growth. We have a strong domestic economy, as well as obviously a strong international presence as well. In terms of talent and education, these are very much the cornerstones of our economy. So while a favorable tax regime and ease of doing business are important, it is really our skilled workforce and strong education system that drives continued investment into Ireland. Some of the largest companies in the world across a range of sectors have established both their European and in some cases, their global headquarters here in Ireland. The last key pillar really is the ease at which one can do business in Ireland. So our tax, legislative and regulatory environment is very predictable and consistent. There's minimal bureaucracy in terms of what a company has to do to file returns with the revenue commissioners or the company's office. It's very seamless and straightforward. There isn't red tape in the way, and maintaining regulatory compliance is very streamlined and simple. Over to you, Dimitri.
Окей. Здесь на этом слайде Эйден рассказывает о ключевых преимуществах Ирландии, ну, с макроэкономической точки зрения. Он подчеркивает, что в течение последних десятилетий Ирландия довольно стабильно развивается экономически. Кроме того, сделан акцент на развитие таланта и образования местного населения, что прочувствовали мировые гиганты, которые перенесли свои штаб-квартиры, некоторые из них большие компании в Ирландии, во всяком случае, хаб для Европы. Мы знаем эти истории с Google и подобными организациями. Кроме того, довольно, скажем так, стабильный и невысокий уровень налогообложения, он тоже является фактором, который создает среду для развития бизнеса. Поэтому вот эти моменты Эйден подчеркнул. Эйден, thank you so much. We can proceed.
Thank you. So here we have a visual of some of the key characteristics of Ireland's economy, and some of which I have already touched on. I mentioned our people, our well-educated population. So just to give context, 60% of 25 to 34-year-olds have a third level qualification in Ireland, and that is 17 percentage points above the European average. So normally in Europe, less than half of 25 to 34-year-olds would have a third level qualification. We are 60% in Ireland. We have the youngest working population in Europe, and we also have the fourth highest international workforce in the EU. So as we'll see later on, Ireland is at full employment, or deemed full employment. And to grow our economy and to strengthen our economy, we have to, inward migration into the country from all parts of the world is very, very important. And that's covering all sectors of our economy, from financial services to hospitality, all the way down to every sort of role. Okay. Our corporate tax regime is highly favourable, and it's obviously very important to the Irish economy. So our 12.5% corporation tax rate is well below that of most European countries, where it tends to be between 20 and 30%. So that is a very, very attractive selling point for Ireland in terms of establishing European and global headquarters in Ireland for that reason. Dimitri, I'll hand to you.
Could you give more details of R&D tax credit? Is it tax credit as a part of individual taxation or as corporate taxation? For my understanding, Aidan.
Sure, no problem. This is my colleague Michael's domain, so I'll make sure I get this right. So the R&D tax credit is available to companies in Ireland. So if companies are engaging in what is called qualifying research and development, it can actually obtain a rebate from the government, or a credit, a payment from the government to help fund that activity. And that rebate is 30% of the total qualifying spend at the moment. But my colleague Michael will cover this particular point in great detail later on.
Great. Thanks so much.
Thank you for your question.
I'm translating. Значит, здесь изложены ключевые преимущества ирландской экономики. Базовая ставка налога 12,5%, Плюс, как мы обсудили только что, есть R&D льгота, то есть 30% расходов образуют дополнительную скидку к налогообложению. Более подробно об этом будет говорить Майкл Скеттл в его части доклада. Ирландия, ну, я так понимаю, средний возраст рабочей силы самый юный в Европе. И при этом еще они находятся на четвертом месте, ну, с точки зрения международной рабочей силы. Полная занятость или, ну, как он сказал, deemed, ну, то есть предполагаемая условная полная занятость населения. Компанию Ирландию любят фармацевтические компании, 10 глобальных находятся из ней, и IT-компании тоже, топ-5 глобальных IT-компаний находятся в Ирландии. То есть это вот такие моменты, где пересекаются возраст, юное население, образованное население, полностью занятое, работающее в международных структурах. И определенные налоговые льготы, которые позволяют это двигать вперед. Aidan, thank you so much. You can proceed.
Thank you. So, here are when we look at foreign direct investment into Ireland, we can see the majority of the world's major players across a range of sections have operations here, as I mentioned. And just to pick out a couple of these, so we can see there 90% of the world's top global software companies have established significant operations here. 90% of the top pharma companies in the world, so pharmaceutical manufacturing, have established significant operations here. And half of the world's financial services, leading financial services firms, have established operations here. Let's take a look at some examples. Over to you, Dmitry.
Перед тем, как перейти к примерам, здесь общий овервью, ключевых, так сказать, индустрий, точнее, глобальных лидеров, находящихся в Ирландии. 9 из 10 глобальных IT-компаний, то же самое фармацевтических компаний, компаний, которые вышли из интернета. Очень сильно представлен финансовый сектор и также Industrial Automation Companies, я так понимаю, это стык хардвера и софтвера. И сейчас Aidan перейдет к примерам компаний, которые развились на ирландском рынке. Aidan, you can proceed.
So Dublin's Silicon Docks, as we call it, to steal the name from Silicon Valley in California, is home to almost all of the world's major technology companies. Many of those, as I'm sure you can see on screen, you will recognize. And many of these companies are expanding their presence in Dublin and investing further, particularly Google, Microsoft and Amazon in particular.
Собственно, это примеры компаний, которые засетапились в так называемых Dublin Silicon Docks, это, я так понимаю, индустриальная зона, и, соответственно, выбрали ее в качестве хаба Google, Microsoft, eBay, Amazon и так далее. Aidan, we can go through.
Sure. Looking at another key sector is Ireland's pharmaceutical industry, and this has a much more has a very significant and much broader presence across the country. So where our software leading software companies are predominantly Dublin based, our pharmaceutical industry is very much countrywide, and these companies have established a presence all across the country, close to our major cities in the west and south of the country. Some of these, again, you will likely recognize yourselves.
Aidan, are these companies, what are the function? Laboratories or distributors or hub for the rest of Europe?
So it would be a mix of both, Dimitro. So most of them would be manufacturing. And I think this kind of dovetails well with Ireland's education system, in that a lot of the universities provide the courses and training to to people here, both internationally and people who were born, obviously Irish people, to make sure that their workers are skilled to produce the drugs and devices that these companies produce. So it is very much a manufacturing and a distribution element in Ireland, with the pharma sector in particular.
Вот. А это примеры компаний из фармацевтического сектора, которые являются мировыми лидерами и в силу качественного образованного рынка труда в Ирландии выбрали, соответственно, Ирландию как место для развития производственных мощностей. Pfizer, Roche, Merck, Johnson & Johnson, Novartis, Sanofi, AstraZeneca и так далее. Thank you again. We can proceed.
Now, we'll just look at some recent statistics for the Irish economy, which really supports the 4 key pillars I mentioned earlier. So looking at our growth forecasts over the next 18 months, the economy is expected to grow by just over 2%. And this is really driven, as I mentioned, by a strong domestic economy, but it also anticipates a more positive international outlook also. In terms of unemployment, I mentioned that Ireland's unemployment rate is low at 4.7%. So this is considered full employment in Ireland. And that represents roughly 2.7 million people in Ireland that are working at the moment. Demand for talent across all sectors of the economy is particularly high, and inward migration, as I mentioned, continues to play a key role in meeting this demand and growing our economy. In terms of inflation, Ireland has actually performed better on average than our European counterparts. Inflation in the Irish economy was only 1.5%, and that's nearly half of the Eurozone average. So it speaks to the strong management of the Irish economy at government level. And in terms of our national debt, then, I suppose we look at the national debt in terms of its size versus gross domestic product, or GDP. And that 181 billion euro national debt is 36% of Ireland's gross domestic product. So just to give a context on that, in most larger European nations, the national debt as a percentage of GDP would be typically 100% or more. So Ireland is producing far more in terms of gross domestic product than it has in its national debt, which again emphasizes the stability of the country. Дмитрий.
Здесь изображены 4 основных экономических столба, которые делают экономику Ирландии привлекательной. Во-первых, стабильный рост. То есть 2,1% ежегодного роста. Это по европейским меркам признак, как сказать, стабильности и экономической устойчивости. Это хорошо. То есть для Украины, может быть, это с нашими скачками не сильно показатель, но по европейским меркам это хорошо. Практически отсутствует безработица. То есть написано virtually full employment, то есть виртуально все при работе, хотя как-то они там высчитывают 4,7% все-таки безработных, но это тоже небольшие показатели. Небольшие показатели инфляции 1,5%. Это тоже, правда, хорошо. И национальный долг в сравнении с валовым внутренним продуктом тоже невелик. 181 миллион составляет 35% от GDP Ирландии. И поэтому вот эти 4 критерия являются признаками здоровой экономики. Aidan, we can proceed.
Thank you. So finally, to conclude this agenda item, I suppose while Ireland is a good place to invest and do business, it is also important to emphasize that it isn't just a one-way street. Many Irish businesses have established operations across the world, including the Ukraine and in Western Europe. In Eastern Europe, should I say. Here we have some examples of leading Irish businesses who have invested in the Ukraine in particular, and some of these you may be aware of. Ryanair, who you're likely most familiar with, is the largest airline in Europe and carry roughly 180 million passengers a year. CRH and Kingspan are both construction material suppliers. Both of these countries have established significant manufacturing operations in the Ukraine and continue to invest even today as well. And just another note as well, I am aware our Prime Minister, Simon Harris, or the Taoiseach as we call him in Ireland, is actually visiting the Ukraine this week. And I suppose this further emphasises the links between our countries in that we want to help each other and foster good relationships.
Вот этот слайд посвящен Украине. Это вот с большой благодарностью и гордостью мы произносим, что несмотря и вопреки войне, Ирландия заинтересована в инвестициях в Украину. И тут три примера, собственно. Первое – это Ryanair. Их Chief Executive Officer Майкл Алири посетил Украину и заявил, что сразу после войны будет инвестировать в украинскую авиапромышленность. 3 биллиона – это миллионов или миллиарда. Биллион – это, кажется, миллиарды, сейчас мы перепроверим. Если миллиарды, то это очень большая сумма. Дальше CRH, который уже инвестирует, то есть тут как раз вот для CRH война не помеха, и только с начала войны уже произвел инвестиции на 80 миллионов, это правда. И, наконец, компания Kingspan, тоже вопреки войне, она инвестирует 280 миллионов в создание производственных мощностей. Наверное, биллион это миллиард. Если я не прав, то мы скажем. Aidan, thank you so much for this slide. My personal gratitude. We can proceed.
Thank you. So now that you have a flavour of Ireland's economy and the country itself, we're now going to move on to some more practical matters. So firstly, let's look at some business and investment structures that we typically see in Ireland. Dimitri, if you want to.
Сейчас мы закончили вот такую общеобразовательную часть про экономику и переходим к разделам, посвященным корпоративным структурам. То есть как структурировать бизнес в Ирландии, какие инструменты и структуры здесь возможны. Спасибо.
Okay. So here, while we have listed the typical types of investment structures we see, some of them are corporate and some of them are non-corporate or unincorporated. In the vast majority of cases, given that investors are likely to already have corporate structures in place in their own jurisdiction or in their home country, a corporate structure is generally what is also used in Ireland. So for that reason, I won't spend too much time going through the unincorporated structures at the bottom of the slide. I'll focus on the corporate structures towards the top. Looking at the corporate structures then, there are 5 listed here, as you can see, and each have different characteristics. I will give a brief description of each. So firstly, a private limited company. This can be one of 2 types, so an LTD or a DAC. An LTD sometimes is referred to as a model company. This is the most basic type of company that can be used. It offers maximum flexibility in terms of what you can do, and it has the least onerous compliance requirements. So you have, through an LTD, you have maximum flexibility to do the business you want to do, and the reporting to regulators, the revenue commissioners and the Companies Office in Ireland is at its lowest for an LTD company. A DAC, or a designated activity company, as it's so a DAC for short, stands for designated activity company, as I mentioned. This is very similar to an LTD, except there are restrictions on what you can do. And there are a few more requirements in terms of compliance and ongoing maintenance from a regulatory point of view. So both LTDs and DACs are by far the most common types of companies used by foreign investors and groups who look to establish operations here in Ireland. So I will look at these in a little more detail in a later slide, but I just would like to give you a sense of what the other company types are, just to give you a flavour for them. So looking at public limited companies, or PLCs, these are only typically used where a company is looking to have its shares listed on a stock exchange or offering them to the public. So a normal LTD company or model company or a DAC would have a limit on the number of direct shareholders it can have, but a PLC that's listed on a stock exchange won't have this limit. So that's why we have a different type for public limited companies. Unlimited companies, then, moving to the next one, you can incorporate a private or a public unlimited company. However, the big disadvantage for an unlimited company is that the liabilities of the business, the debts of the business, are not limited within the company. So they actually fall on the shareholders as well. So for that reason, unlimited companies are not used by foreign investors. They stick with the limited liability structure. Companies limited by guarantee. So these are typically used by charities or not-for-profit organizations where there isn't a need for profit extraction or wealth extraction from them. So again, for a foreign investor coming into Ireland, a company limited by guarantee won't typically be used, but just to make you aware of the type of company that it is. Lastly, then, is establishing a branch of a foreign agency. So this is really where a foreign company creates a tax presence in Ireland. So it doesn't create a corporate presence, it's only a taxable presence, okay? The real disadvantage with a branch of a foreign agency is that while the branch's activities will be taxed at the Irish rate, the 12.5% rate for trading, the likelihood is that there will be the home country rate will be applied on the difference because there isn't a corporate structure in Ireland. And that's typically the type of arrangement we see between Ireland and other countries. And Ireland, as Michael will allude to later on, has a treaty network with many, many countries across the world. And that is typically the arrangement. So for that reason, we don't see many foreign investors setting up branches in Ireland. They actually set up an actual limited company to manage the Irish operations. Okay. Dimitri, I'll hand back to you.
Здесь изложены основные типы компаний, которые действуют на территории Ирландии. Я где-то буду вдаваться в детали, где-то нет. Понятное дело, что самый распространенный тип это LTD. Есть еще у них DAC, разновидность LTD, Designated Activity Company, где специально ограничиваются виды деятельности для данной компании. Она, получается, сама себя ограничивает. Вот. И дальше Public Limited Company используется для тех компаний, которые листингуются на фондовой бирже. Есть, как и у нас, компании с неограниченной ответственностью, есть представительства или филиалы иностранных компаний. И кроме того, есть образования бизнесовые, которые не инкорпорированные, да, типа индивидуальный предприниматель, sole trader, партнерство. Также, его разновидность, как-то мы с вами и по Швейцарии, по Великобритании исследовали Limited Liability Partnership, то есть это какой-то стык между совместной деятельностью и бизнесом. И также существуют фонды коллективного инвестирования. I could ask you, limited liability partnership, it is not a company, or it is some type of company?
So a limited liability partnership, it would be, so the partners in a limited liability partnership can be companies or people. However, the tax benefits, it's seen as a see-through. So the tax rates that would be applied on the earnings of the partnership would be the home tax rates or the tax rates of the individuals involved in the partnership. So again, you wouldn't get the benefit of the 12.5% rate that's available through the limited company structure.
Ну, limited liability partnership, видите, да, устроены как и в Британии, Швейцарии, LP, LLP. Тобто їх учредителями могут быть компании, однако налогообложение вот этих структур в силу того, что они налогово-прозрачные, transparent, как сказал Эйден, tax transparent, оно будет осуществляться на уровне учредителей этого партнерства, а не на уровне партнерства как такового. Эйден, thank you so much for clarification. We can pass.
No problem. Thank you. So, as I mentioned in the previous slide, by far the most common types of companies used by foreign investors are the model company, the LTD, or the designated activity company, the DAC. So here, I just wanted to highlight some of the key differences here. So the first one is there is no requirement to have an object clause. What this means in simple terms is that you have maximum flexibility in an LTD to conduct business as you see fit, okay? Obviously within the confines of the law, etc. But what you're doing isn't restricted to a particular activity. Whereas in a DAC company, you are restricted to the activity that you've intended to do from the start, okay? And if you want to change, there is a process to follow. So it's a little more onerous, okay? In terms of setting up an LTD or a DAC, there is only a one-document constitution. So just moving to the second point there, there is only a one-document constitution for an LTD. So the constitution is the company's governing documents, and this is publicly available with the Irish Companies Office. It governs things like board resolutions, board shareholder resolutions, as well as the different rights and voting power attached to shares. So for an LTD, this is a very straightforward and standard document. For a DAC or a DAC, this is more complex. There's actually two documents involved in setting that up. Lastly, then, an LTD can have one director. So one director on its board, an LTD is allowed to have one director. For a DAC, it must have at least two directors, okay? So you might ask, why would one use a DAC rather than an LTD, given that there's more compliance requirements, more documents to file? Well, really, DAC companies, designated activity companies, they follow the old traditional company model in Ireland, say 15 years ago, 15, 20 years ago. And typically what we see from, for example, regulators, they will demand that if you're setting up a company to conduct a regulated business, they will say you must operate under a designated activity company, and what you're doing would be specified in the company's constitution, okay? And you're restricted to only those activities that the regulator allows, okay? Another example where I've seen designated activity companies used is where groups might use a special purpose vehicle structure to manage assets, for example. They could be aircraft or ships, say. So typically, the funders would specify that the assets would sit in the special purpose vehicle and they can only be used for certain activities. And that would be specified in the company's constitution. And that's why DACs would be used in that instance. But in the vast majority of cases where companies are just trading normally, manufacturing goods, providing services, LTD structures are the ones that are typically used. Okay, Dimitro?
Aidan, please repeat why we should need two documents for DAC.
So the DAC has a constitution, okay, which covers all the things in the LTD. And the second document is called a Memorandum of Articles of Association. It's a bit of a mouthful. but that does all the extra things that I mentioned, the specific purpose and all that type of stuff. Yeah.
Understand. I'm translating. Значит, этот слайд более подробно рассказывает о самой популярной форме организации бизнеса в Ирландии, собственно, LTD и DAC. LTD у них очень стандартная, то есть это такая модельная компания. Единственным документом, который регулирует, является, вот здесь написано Constitution, это типа нашего устава. Нет требований к целям деятельности данной компании, и в ней, соответственно, должен присутствовать минимум один директор и секретарь, как требования к организации. Designated Activity Company, DAC, она создается для определенной цели. Или эта цель ограничена законодательством для определенных видов деятельности, или сами ее участники ее формулируют. Например, управление определенным объектом. Вот, и поэтому DAC это вот скорее там special purpose vehicle, когда существует определенная цель у ее создателей, которые они пытаются достигнуть. Поэтому требования к данной компании, собственно, эту цель иметь, и отсюда ограничения по деятельности. Во-вторых, документов, которые регулируют уже не один, а два. Кроме собственно, базового уставного документа, они подписывают также Memorandum of Association, в котором излагаются вот эти детали их деятельности, целей и прочие ограничивающие моменты. И в данной компании должно быть минимум 2 директора. Но Эйден подчеркивает, чтобы нас не запутать, что, конечно же, доминирующим типом организации компании является LTD. Просто потому что он проще. Aiden, thank you so much. You can proceed.
No problem. So next, I would just like to talk through the process of setting up a company in Ireland. So this is very, very straightforward. So once the documentation is submitted to the company's registration office, or CRO for short, it takes approximately 1 to 2 weeks to incorporate the company. There are some practical aspects to be aware of, as you can see here in the middle of the slide, and I'll just talk through these briefly. So the company name, in general, can be anything you want, except there are certain conditions. So the name cannot be something generic. For example, IT Solutions Limited. So that's a very generic type name. However, if I said Aidan Ryan IT Solutions Limited, I've now made it specific, and that would likely be accepted. Okay. Similarly, when the name is submitted, it cannot be too similar to a pre-existing company, so as people might confuse it. Okay. So typically what we do is, before we submit the documentation to the company's office, we ask the company's office, is this name acceptable? And that way they come back and confirm, and that way there'll be no issue with the name. We will know it will be an acceptable name before the documentation is submitted. This naturally avoids a headache. If we submitted the documents and then there was a rejection, that would waste time. So thankfully that process is in place. The registered office. So every company in Ireland must have a registered office address. Okay. And this is the address where any government or formal legal notices will be sent. Okay. So from a practical point of view, where we have foreign investors looking to set up a company in Ireland, but they haven't actually established a physical presence yet, rented an office, we can facilitate the provision of a registered office for you in the first instance. And then when you have your established operations, we can move the registered office. Very, very straightforward process. Okay. In terms of directors, as I mentioned, for an LTD, a company can have 1 director. For a DAC, it must have at least 2 directors. Under Irish legislation, at least 1 director of the company must be resident within the European Economic Area. So the European Economic Area consists of the EU 27 countries, plus Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein. Okay, so 27 plus 3, 30 countries. If for some reason practical reason that it doesn't make sense to have a director of a company that is resident in the EEA, there are alternative arrangements that can be put in place, such as a non-resident director insurance bond. So the insurance bond costs roughly €2,500 for every 2-year period. So the bond is a 2-year bond and it costs €2,500. And this is only required where there is no director on the board of the company that is resident within the EEA. Okay. One further point to note in relation to the EEA, the UK, having left the European Union, is no longer part of the EEA. So there is, just to clarify that point, UK resident directors are not considered part of the EEA at the moment. The company secretary. So the company secretary is a separate role to the director and they have separate duties. So they would have much less powers than the directors, but it is a role that a company is required to have nonetheless. Okay. The role really encompasses the maintaining of board minutes, the maintaining of the company's director register, shareholder registers, changes to the company that have happened historically, all those types of things, the documentation, etc. Okay. Typically, what we see is that companies outsource this role to a professional service provider, but it can also be fulfilled by a director of the company if you wish. And I should point out that while a director can fill the role of a company secretary, this is only the case where there is at least one other director in the company. So if I have an LTD company with one director, that person cannot be the company secretary. Okay. But if I have an LTD company with 2 directors, one of them can be the company secretary. So there's just a slight little nuance to be considered there. When you're setting up the company day one and you potentially engage a professional service provider to help you with this, they will advise you based on your own circumstances how best to structure the company secretary role. Okay. Lastly, share capital. So this is a key part of the application form. For private companies in Ireland, there's no minimum level of share capital that you have to have. It can be as little as fractions of 1 cent, or it could be €1,000,000, for example. Okay. In terms of how you structure your share capital, you can issue as many shares as you like, and they can have a value of whatever you choose. So, and another point to make in relation to share capital is you can issue different types of share capital. So you can have ordinary share capital, for example, which would have full entitlements to voting rights and benefits of profit extraction. And you might have another type of share capital called A share capital, which might have only voting rights, but no entitlement to profit. But the point I'm making is you have full flexibility in terms of how you set up your capital structure within an Irish company. Okay. Typically, from a practical perspective, where a foreign investor comes to us and they say, I want to set up an Irish company, I have it is just going to be a 100% owned subsidiary. There's no complex capital structure required. We typically say the most common structure we go with is that you issue 100 shares at €1 each, and that's €100 of share capital. And typically the parent company in the home country would own those shares and hold those shares in the Irish company. Okay. But the broader point is, if you have some complex share capital structure requirements, we listen to those and we set up the company in a manner that suits your needs. Dimitro, I'll hand it to you.
A couple of questions. First, are there any requirements to minimal share capital?
So for a private limited company, no, there's no minimum requirement. For a public limited company, it's €25,000. So if you are a public limited company, the likelihood is you will be well above €25,000. So it's kind of a nominal limit. But for a private limited company, no, there's no minimum requirement.
I understand. And other restrictions or requirements for the office, say, can it be living apartments or flexi desk or mere address? How it works in Ireland?
An excellent question. Thank you. The only requirement for the address is that it is an address in the Republic of Ireland. That's it. It can be a serviced office address, your professional advisor, whatever works. And that's why I say it's very much dependent on your circumstances. What do you need? That type of thing.
And just to repeat my understanding, the director should be the resident of European community, correct?
Should be, yes. It can be outside, okay? So if someone, for example, wanted to set up a company in Ireland, a Ukrainian citizen and resident in Ukraine, and they want to be the only director, they would have to pay the insurance bond in that scenario. But often what we can do in that situation is there are professional directors in Ireland that can assist with that role to avoid that cost if needed. Okay.
Okay. Я коротко перескажу. Ключевые требования к компании, имя, офис, где в Ирландии довольно как раз гибкие требования. Главное, чтобы это был адрес на территории Ирландии. И, в принципе, нет ограничений. Там должен быть это нежилое помещение, бизнес-центр или там просто место, где учредитель живет. А директоры, вот тут как раз требование довольно жесткое, что директором должен быть лицо, которое, резидент Европейского экономического сообщества, Евросоюза. Но Эйден отмечает, что, скажем, если, допустим, украинец релоцируется в Ирландию, как ему быть? Он говорит, надо тогда купить так называемый insurance bond, типа страхового полиса, как я понял. И это дает возможность претендовать на то, чтобы быть директором. Также должен быть секретарь в компании. В некоторых случаях, в некоторых типах компании он может совмещаться с директором, в некоторых должен быть отдельно. Ну и, наконец, должен быть капитал. Для частных компаний, private limited company, нет требований к минимальному размеру капитала. Для публичных компаний есть, составляет 25 тысяч евро. Капитал, ясное дело, должен быть структурирован на акции, иметь номинал данных акций. Он тоже, требования к нему являются гибкими, можно, как конструктор, сотворить то, что вам нужно, там, голосующие акции, не голосующие акции и так далее. Но если мы не хотим вдаваться в сложности, например, если приходим к Эйдену, он просто рекомендует, давайте вы выпустите 100 акций по 1 евро, и это таким образом вы соблюдете требования к вашему уставному капиталу. А срок создания компании, регистрация 1-2 недели. Aiden, thank you so much. We can proceed.
Great. So, in addition to looking at the process of setting up a company, it's also obviously important to look at what the ongoing annual compliance requirements of an Irish company would look like. The first piece is the annual return. This is a filing that is submitted to the Irish Companies Registration Office every year. And all this return is just to really confirm to the Companies Office at the date of the return some very basic information about the company. Its name, its directors and secretary, its shareholders at any time during the year and at the year end. It's a very, very basic return, okay? And that's submitted once per year. I should point out as well that while the annual return is filed annually, hence annual return, if there are changes to the board of the company or the registered office or the share capital makeup of the company, those types of events need to be notified to the CRO within 14 days of when they happen. So typically for companies with foreign investors, there doesn't tend to be a lot of change in the board. So there isn't often a requirement to file. But your professional advisor in Ireland will notify you, look, if the registered office has changed, or there's new share capital issued, or the board has changed in any way, that those things would be notified to the company's registration office. Okay. And again, they're very simple forms to file. The second part of the annual return is to attach the company's annual financial statements. Okay. Both the annual return and the financial statements of the company will be available to the public once they are filed. Okay. And in terms of what the financial statements are and what they look like, first and foremost, they must be prepared in a statutory format. So this is a format required by legislation in Ireland. Profit and loss account, balance sheet, and the accompanying notes to the financial statements. These are things I'm sure you're very familiar with in your own jurisdiction. It's very, very similar. Okay. The other requirement is that we follow an allowable financial reporting framework. So in Ireland, there are really two frameworks you're allowed to apply. You can apply what's called Irish generally accepted accounting practice, or you can apply international financial reporting standards as adopted by the European Union. So just to give context, for example, US generally accepted accounting practice wouldn't be allowed to present financial statements in Ireland. You must use one of those two. Okay. The Irish generally accepted accounting practice is very similar to that of the UK, and it's also a derivative of international financial reporting standards, really. So there is very much your accounting practices in your home country are likely very, very similar to those applied in Ireland. So there wouldn't be a huge divergence, particularly for more simpler business models. Okay. In terms of then the period for which your financial statements are prepared, so like other jurisdictions, this is generally a 12-month period, or a year is for when the financial statements are prepared. However, Irish legislation allows for a maximum period of 18 months for a financial period for a set of financial statements. Okay. And the reason for this is that obviously companies incorporate not at the start of a financial period, 1st of January, for example. This just allows them to prepare the financial statements from the date of incorporation up to a desired financial year end, if that's 31 December or later, or whatever it may be. Okay. So it just allows that flexibility in terms of having to file financial statements. Okay. In terms then of the audit requirement, okay, this really depends on, when I talk about audit and the consolidation requirement, this really depends on the size of the company, okay, or the group that it's part of. So taking the audit requirement firstly, this is dependent on the size of the worldwide group, okay? So the criteria there, as you can see, are listed on the right-hand side of the slide here. So we have headcount, turnover, which is top line revenue, and total assets. So from an audit perspective, if the worldwide group, okay, so that comprises the Irish company, its parent companies, and any fellow subsidiaries either side of it, if that group together exceeds two of those three thresholds, then the Irish company will require a statutory audit. Okay, and that's a service that's performed by someone like myself or other audit practitioners in Ireland. Okay, so it's a little bit difficult to get your head around, but it's the worldwide group consideration impacts the Irish company's position. In terms of consolidation, then, this really only applies where the Irish company that you've set up has subsidiaries of its own. So if the Irish company is a holding company and has subsidiaries, that's the only time you need to be concerned about the consolidation requirement. So in applying the thresholds for consolidation, you don't look at the worldwide group, you only look at the Irish company and its subsidiaries. Okay? So if the Irish company and its subsidiaries breach the thresholds listed on the right-hand side, and again, it's 2 out of the 3, you must prepare consolidated or group financial statements. Okay. I hope I've explained that clearly. In terms of the gross and net, all that really means is that net is the threshold after elimination of intercompany transactions has been completed, and gross is before the elimination of intercompany transactions. So from a net point of view, any income earned between subsidiaries or parents within a group is excluded from the calculation, but from a gross point of view, it's included. So what the idea of the two thresholds is to say, okay, you may not breach from a net point of view. So my intercompany turnover means I'm underneath the threshold. But if I look at the gross threshold, before I eliminate that, I might be over the turnover threshold. Okay. So it does try to catch you at both points. What we typically say to our clients here is that when it comes to preparing your first set of financial statements, we will obviously have an understanding of the group structure and the size of the group at the outset, and we will be able to tell you if you're likely going to need an audit or a consolidation at that point in time. Okay, Dimitri, I'll hand that to you.
Okay, before I start translation, I have a question from myself and from our audience. From audience, reporting is available online or only offline? How? Whether we can submit reports online or offline?
It's all the submissions, I should have mentioned, excuse me. All the submissions in Ireland now are online. Every submission. Yeah. There's almost nothing that needs to be done in a physical copy.
And the question from myself, maybe I couldn't catch it. The deadline for reporting and for the audit.
Sure. Great question. So this depends on the year end of the company, and that's probably part of the reason I didn't deal with it here. So take a December year end, Dimitri, for example. Okay, so December 2023. Okay, so every company in Ireland has what's called an annual return date. Okay, and this is the date by which the filings are determined. So in most cases where you have a 31 December year end, the annual return date will be the 30th of September 2020. So for example, December 23, September 24. Okay. The actual filing of the financial statements and annual return, you have 8 weeks from then to actually submit the documentation. So in reality, you have almost 11 months post year end to actually complete your financial statements and audit and make your submissions to the company's office. Okay. From a tax point of view, and I'm going to steal Michael's thunder here, September is the deadline from a tax perspective. Okay, but they're parallel things; they're not linked together.
And as of the deadline for mandatory audit, all the reports should be audited within these deadlines.
So what you're submitting with your annual return is your financial statements with an audit report attached to them. So the audit requirement is at the same date as the date you file the annual return. So typically the process would be the financial statements are prepared, they're approved by the board of directors. So that could be 1 or 2 people. And then the auditor, someone like myself, would provide an audit report on those financial statements. And all of that together is submitted to the company's registration office in November, in my example.
Okay. Thanks so much. Я постараюсь перевести много информации. Ну, понятное дело, что бухгалтерский учет, он ведется по принципам или германского ГААПа, или АФРС. Значит, есть прикол с периодом, отчетным периодом. Ну, то есть обычно он составляет год, но есть возможность выбрать максимальный период 18 месяцев. Дедлайн на подачу отчетности – это ну, так называемое окно от 9 до 11 месяцев с момента окончания отсчетного периода. Ну, то есть где-то там в итоге, да, там с сентября по ноябрь, да, происходит подача этой отчетности. Если отчетность требует и налоговая тоже примерно в эти периоды, сентябрь, как сказал Фридом. Если отчетность требует аудита, вы видите на экране цифры для одной компании или для группы, то есть для аудита нужно пробить 2 из 3 критериев, которые вы видите на экране, то, соответственно, одновременно делается и аудит. То есть эти окошки на подачу отчетности, они уже, ну, отчетность, если она требует аудита, должна быть аудирована. Тобто составляется финотчетность, представляется директором, и отдельно аудитор подтверждает правильность этой отчетности. И консолидация для холдингов только предусмотрена, тоже те же цифры применяются, которые вы видите на экране. Критерии, как я понял, должны быть 3 из 3, чтобы, и только для холдингов, для того, чтобы, ну, чтобы мы подавали именно консолидированную отчетность. Отчетность подается онлайн. Это ответ на вопрос Андрея. Спасибо вам за вопрос. Кажется, все. Aiden, thank you so much. We can proceed.
No problem. Okay. So, lastly, from my side, I just want to talk about some of the practicalities about opening bank accounts in Ireland. So, in Ireland, we have 3 main pillar banks. There are others, but these would be the main 3. AIB, or Allied Irish Bank, Bank of Ireland, or PTSB, or Permanent TSB. So, I suppose opening a bank account for a foreign owned or controlled Irish company can be a detailed process. Okay. The bank are going to require the completion of a fairly detailed application form, and you will be required to provide information about the company, its directors, its shareholders, the group it is part of, and what it intends to do in Ireland. Okay. It is likely that the bank will want to meet the directors of the company and possibly the shareholders, depending on what the structure is, the ownership structure of the company is. And really, that meeting is about the bank becoming comfortable that they understand what it is you intend to do in Ireland. So, my advice here would be openness and transparency with the bank at that point in time will go a long way towards avoiding any problems with opening the account later on. Okay. So having specific details about what you intend to do, where your premises will be, how many employees you will have, what markets you are selling your goods or services to. So while you might establish here, you might be selling into Ireland, you could also be selling into Europe or further afield. So that type of information, very, very useful in making the bank comfortable that they understand what you're doing. Okay. In terms of documentation that the bank will need, so in addition to the application form, there is the standard anti-money laundering documents that the bank are required to hold under legislation. They're required to hold that. So typically, this is just a certified photo ID for the directors and a certified proof of address. So this would typically be a recent utility bill, so gas or electricity utility bill, dated within 3 months of the meeting or the date it's provided to the bank. Okay. They will also likely request the same documentation for any shareholders who are not directors that have a beneficial interest of 25% or more. But it's really up to the discretion of the bank. They may look for everyone over 15% or 10%. It just depends on the structure. Okay. So having said all that and having met the bank, submitted the application form, and you've explained to them what you intend to do, it still typically takes around 3 months to open the bank account. So between correspondence with individuals in the bank and just our experience with the nature of how quick they process applications, we generally say to clients 3 months is the time period you need to allow when opening a bank account. Dimitro, I'll hand over to you.
And one more question. As I expect, the very important part of this check is understanding that the source of fund is legal and the
Absolutely.
taxes are
Yeah.
paid. Uh,
Really covered in your ownership structure, Dimitro. So where obviously your funding is part of that. Generally, where there's a foreign investor, they're providing the funding through that ownership structure. So that should hopefully become apparent in that conversation. Yeah.
And one more question from my personal side. From time to time, we provide confirmation for our clients, for the foreign banks, that we are lawyers or auditors, confirm that we have checked the legality of source of funds and can prove that everything is legal. Is it works for Irish banks, such confirmation? Or you didn't hear of it?
So at the outset of establishing a relationship with an Irish bank for the first time, it is unlikely that they will accept something from someone else like that. You will need to provide the documentation, as I mentioned. However, once you've established that relationship and say, for example, you want to obtain finance from the bank for a particular project or whatever it may be, the bank might say to you, okay, no problem, let's get this moving. However, can you get me a letter from your auditor to say that there's no changes to the board and all of this is correct, right? And in that particular instance, we typically provide a one-page letter to say exactly what you've outlined there. But the important point is, at the outset, it's unlikely that that would be sufficient.
Thanks so much, I'm translating. Ну, да, как уж складывается, видите, в большинстве стран, которые мы обозреваем на наших вебинарах, что составить компанию гораздо легче, чем открыть счет. В Ирландии 3 ключевых банка, которые открывают счета. Название вы их видите на экране: AIB Bank of Ireland и PTSB. И, ну, собственно, процедура сводится к тому, что, ну, во-первых, директор должен лично в этот банк явиться. Во-вторых, он должен пройти вот эту самую процедуру KYC или Anti-Money Laundering, которая может длиться за 3 месяца. То есть в ходе этой процедуры он заполняет документацию и предоставляет информацию, посвященную корпоративной структуре, источнику легальному происхождению средств и подтверждение, ну, потому что это, ну, реалистично, да, там, например, от директора могут потребовать коммунальные счета, но демонстрирующие, что он реально проживает где-то в определенной территории, в Ирландии, например, да. Вот. И частично эта информация может требоваться также об акционерах компании, которые регистрируются. Ну, в принципе, коротко все. Мы понимаем, что это, да, будет процесс, и он, ну, займет время, довольно приличное время. Aiden, understanding that this is the final slide, I would like to thank you, but we have one question from our audience, which is addressed for your presentation. What is the situation with office space availability and costs both in London and in the other parts of the country?
That is a great question. So it's an interesting one, actually. I suppose it depends on what you want to do. So for example, if you have a very small team in Ireland, 5 or 6 people, using offices of a serviced office provider like Huckletree or WeWork or things like that can be very cost effective, and obviously have all the facilities that a business needs to operate. That can be quite cost effective. If you have larger operations, what we have in Ireland, there's a lot of many roles in Ireland now have a mix of hybrid working. So a lot of people work from home rather than in the office in their day-to-day job, which has reduced the value of commercial office space. There are, like, in all the major cities around Ireland, there is plenty of commercial space available. The costs wouldn't be overly onerous, I would say, but if you're starting off with a small team, the serviced office arrangement is probably makes the most sense at the start. Okay. And I should point out as well, like our travel network between Ireland as well is very, very strong, and between Dublin and all the major cities. So, you know, if you come to Ireland and establish yourself in Cork or Limerick or Dublin, you know, it's no more than 2 hours drive, 2.5 hours drive away. So there is plenty of options and flexibility in that regard.
2 euros per square meter, or what? Maybe I understand.
Sorry, the travel time between the cities is what I mentioned.
2
Sorry,
hours.
yeah.
2 hours.
Yeah, small country. Yeah, yeah.
And what is very rough range of cost of square meters of lease of the office?
I'm to be honest with you, I'm not sure, and I'd say that it varies hugely. Like if you're in Dublin city centre, or if you're on outskirts of Dublin, or if you move out to the other major cities, it could vary hugely. But I can get you, I can ask my colleagues, and I'll get you some ranges for that.
Я переведу. По поводу возможностей, ну, то есть доступности офисов. Но Эйден говорит, что после того, как начался ковид и люди привыкли работать из дома, то очень много свободных офисных помещений, то есть нет никаких проблем. Но говорит, если мы говорим о том, чтобы сэкономить, но есть хорошая такая штука, как сервис-офисы, ну, я понял, что они напоминают наши коворкинги. Ну, где вы приходите, вам предоставляется вся инфраструктура, поработали сколько нужно часов и уехали. То есть если, ну, мы говорим о старте работы, то, наверное, лучше начинать с вот такого варианта. Вот. Кроме того, ну, стоимость аренды, то есть если уже мы идем в полноценный офис, ну, сильно отличается между городами и в зависимости от того, у нас центр города или окраина. Поэтому он точно не может назвать размер арендной платы, но обещал переспросить. Aidan, thank you so much once again. I understand that we proceed with our next speaker, Mr. Michael Osketten, with X.
Thank you. Thank you, Ditro. And hello, everybody. I think as Aidan has outlined there are a number and a variety of reasons why people might decide to set up their business in Ireland. But undeniably, when it comes to inward investment, the Irish tax system is probably the key factor. I suppose our corporate tax structure is of particular attraction, with the 12.5% rate being the headline feature. But that's not the only incentive. There are also a number of other incentives to look at, and we'll set those out in the presentation today. There are also some challenges and downsides in the Irish tax system that somebody has to address and navigate before they set up a business here, and we'll cover those as well. When somebody is considering setting up business in Ireland, whether that be a trading business or even using Ireland as a holding company location, we would summarise the key tax factors that they need to consider into 4 categories. First of all, our corporate tax structure, which I've mentioned. Secondly, the transfer pricing rules, which will obviously be of particular importance to businesses with an international presence. The third issue is VAT. And the rates and the rules that apply to that, and in particular as they relate to cross-border transactions. And then finally, the taxation of individuals, which could impact, for example, on the tax treatment of high-level executives who would be relocated to Ireland, or just the employees that would be engaged by the business in Ireland. So, Dimitro, if you would like to...
Thanks so much, Michael. I'm translating. Ну, сейчас будет обзор, соответственно, режима налогообложения США, равно льгот, который, извините, в Ирландии, а также льгот, которые применяются. И, ну, с точки зрения анализа, ну, налогового консультанта, к которому приходит бизнесмен, посоветует, да, что с точки зрения налоговой нагрузки работает, да, что мы получим. То вот Майкл это делит на 4 такие большие категории анализа, да, отдела анализа. Первое это корпоративные налоги, ну, понятное дело, да, и мы сетапим компанию и должны понимать, сколько там с прибыли будем уплачивать. Второе, если компания работает на международных рынках, то включается трансфер pricing. Мы должны оценить влияние на вот этой части налогообложения. При продажах в Ирландии включается НДС, должны в нем разобраться. Ну и, наконец, индивидуальное налогообложение, которое касается как заработков топчиков, которые переезжают в Ирландию, так и того наемного персонала, который мы находим на местном рынке. Michael, thank you so much. We can proceed.
Thank you. So when we look at the Irish tax regime and the range of incentives that are available and what are the really favourable aspects of it, the first thing that will always come to mind, I think, is the 12.5% corporation tax rate. It's something of a unique selling point for Ireland. Now, in addition to the 12.5% rate being one of the lowest in Europe, it also has the advantage of certainty. And I say that for two reasons. First of all, because the rate has been in place since 2003, more than 20 years. And during that time, we've had a lot of really big challenges, such as the global financial crash in the early 2010s, Brexit, which had a particular impact on Ireland, the COVID crisis, of course, and all of the other challenges over the past 20 years. And yet the rate remains at that level. The second reason that there is certainty is that in Ireland, unlike many countries, the headline rate of 12.5% and the effective rate of what you actually pay are quite similar. So in a lot of countries, they may have a particular headline rate, but because of various exceptions or exclusions or additions and so on, you might end up paying a different rate of tax to what the headline rate actually is. But that's not the case in Ireland. Another incentive in Ireland is that we have quite a generous regime of tax depreciation for capital expenditure. So whilst the normal assets that a business would acquire to use in its business, such as office equipment or plant and machinery, motor vehicles and so on, are depreciated over an 8-year period, certain assets can be depreciated over a quicker period, such as, for example, environmentally friendly, energy efficient equipment, which can be written off possibly in 1 year, and intellectual property assets, which can sometimes be written off over 5 years or shorter. Another key advantage, and this is particularly the case for international businesses relocating to Ireland or setting up operations in Ireland, is that we are party to an extensive tax treaty network which now covers more than 70 countries. Our tax system is also stable, I think a point that Aidan covered in his presentation, but also illustrated by the 20-year history of the 12.5% rate that I've just discussed. Ireland is also an attractive location for a holding company because it is typically quite easy to repatriate profits, and there are also certain capital gains tax exemptions, and we'll discuss those in more detail on a separate slide. In terms of the payment of dividends from Ireland, say to an overseas parent, that is also quite attractive because typically those funds can flow without withholding tax. If it's a branch profit, there's no withholding tax at all. If it's an actual subsidiary, there are exceptions to dividend withholding tax requirements, which we will look at in a minute. And finally, then, there is a fairly generous system of tax credits covering a range of specialist areas. The R&D tax credit, which Aidan mentioned briefly earlier, is now worth 30% of qualifying expenditure. So if a company engages in research and development with a view to making scientific or technological breakthroughs, they may be able to claim an additional credit of 30% on that, which can reduce their corporation tax liability, or if they're not paying enough corporation tax to use the credit, they may get it in the form of a cash payment from revenue. There are also other credits available in specialist areas, such as for digital gaming and for film schemes. So, Dimitro, would you...
В общих чертах здесь перечислены преимущества налоговой системы Ирландии. Сама ставка налога невелика, базовая 12,5%. Кроме того, существует режим повышенной налоговой амортизации для капиталовложений, капитальных расходов. 70 странами запрещена конвенция об избежании двойного налогообложения. Сама по себе система налоговая стабильна, то есть они ее редко меняют, но вот приведена цитата на фоне. Значит, хороший режим для холдингов, исключение для налога на репатриацию на сумму выплачиваемых дивидендов. Также нет налога на репатриацию с прибылей, которые получают филиалы иностранных компаний. И достаточно такая развитая, написано, щедрая система для налоговых вычетов, в зависимости от ситуации. Michael, can I ask a question? Maybe you will describe it follow. I remember that it was a sort of a Google model where Irish company should pay taxes only if they at the place of if the place of their activities is actually Ireland, not due to the place of registration. Whether it works right now or that doesn't include this principle of registration in Ireland.
Yes, Dimitri. So actually, I think we're going to cover residence on possibly the next slide. But this was something that had happened where companies typically in Ireland are resident here if they're managed and controlled in Ireland. And managed and controlled means that the key decisions impacting the company itself, not just the trade, are taken here. So, for example, the board meetings are held here. The accounts are approved here. The key strategic decisions for the business and the company are taken here. The books and records are retained here, and so on. So that's a management and control test. So I think the issue had been that certain companies were being incorporated in Ireland, but they weren't managed and controlled here, therefore they weren't Irish resident. However, certain countries apply an incorporation or a registration test. The United States, for example. So under their rules, because the company was registered here, it wasn't resident in the United States either. So these were what they called stateless companies. And some of these companies were being used sort of to filter profits through and essentially pay less tax and so on. So in 2015, there was a change made. So companies that are now registered or incorporated in Ireland will be treated as Irish tax resident unless there is a double tax treaty that says otherwise. Now, of course, Ireland has double tax treaties with more than 70 countries, and most of those treaties will say, look, that the company will be resident where it is managed and controlled. So it may well still be that if you have a company that's genuinely, Irish, that position should not change. But if you've got these companies now that are registered in Ireland and not managed and controlled here, but they're not resident in the other country either, then that incorporation test can come into play. But if you can show that they're managed and controlled in a particular country, that should still be the determining factor. So yes, they have tightened up on all of that, but management and control is still the main test.
Я переспросил, извините, то, что меня интересовало, просто помню про схему Гугла, которые зарегистрировали компанию в Ирландии, но весь персонал был в Штатах. И в Штатах они говорили, у нас же компания по месту регистрации в Ирландии, мы здесь не платим. А в Ирландии действует обратный принцип. Ключевое не место регистрации, а место эффективного менеджмента и контроля. Где, например, принимаются ключевые управленческие решения. Поэтому для Ирландии они говорили, у нас же тут менеджмента нет в Калифорнии, поэтому мы у вас тоже платить не должны. Майкл подтверждает, что это по-прежнему работает. Более того, он обращает внимание, что большинство конвенций об избежании двойного налогообложения при определении налогового резидентства компании используют именно критерии менеджмента и контроля, а не критерии регистрации. И это правда, мы это для Украины тоже проверяем. Michael, thank you so much, and we can proceed.
Thank you, Dimitri. So to look then at corporation tax specifically, we've mentioned residence there as being a key factor. And if a company is Irish tax resident, then it is liable to Irish tax on its worldwide profits, so income and gains. Obviously, in some cases, you may have a company that has got income from overseas, and it may be liable to tax in the other country as well on that income. But because of our double tax treaty network, there should be a form of relief, a credit for one against the other. If you haven't got a company, but instead what you have is a branch in Ireland, so a branch of a non-Irish resident company, then the only thing that should be subject to Irish corporation tax are the branch profits themselves. Now, looking at the corporation tax rates, and we've mentioned the 12.5% rate as our famous CT rate, but that applies specifically to trading income from an Irish trade. That's 12.5%. If you've got passive income or investment type income, which is typically things like rental income, interest income, or indeed dividend income, although as we'll see in a minute, there are special treatment for most dividends under the Irish regime, but that type of investment income, that is taxed at a rate of 25%, which is still quite low. Now, if that income is earned by what we call a close company, and in practice in Ireland, a close company means pretty much every company that's not quoted on a stock exchange or is not a PLC, because the definition is that it's controlled by 5 or fewer people, and that covers most companies. So if a close company is in receipt of investment type income, taxed at 25%, then they may also face an additional surcharge that will bring the effective rate of tax on the investment income only up to close to 40% if they don't distribute the investment income to its shareholders within 18 months of the year end. And the reason for that surcharge historically is that because company tax rates are lower than individual income tax rates, they don't want everybody to be using companies for things like rental and investment and so on. So they bring in that surcharge to sort of narrow the gap between the company and personal rates. Also, another key factor to consider is that, but this is only for very large companies and groups with global turnover exceeding 750 million euro, because of the BEPS Pillar 2 rules, from January 2024, they will have a top-up tax that will bring the effective rate of tax on their trading income from 12.5 up to 15%. However, most businesses will still qualify for the 12.5% rate on their trading income. It's only the very large ones that are impacted. One other rate that you should consider is the patent income. Now, patent income is not a straightforward issue, because in some cases, if the patent is just simply being leased to somebody and there's very little management involved for the company itself, it could actually be classed as passive income at 25%. However, if you're actually involved in some way in actively exploiting the patent and managing the process and finding new people to use it and so on, that may be classed as a trade at 12.5%. And better still, it might be possible for it to qualify for an even smaller rate of 10%. Because of what we call the knowledge development box. This is an incentive that was introduced in 2016, and it's where a company engages in R&D itself, and for R&D we mean as defined for the R&D credit, and it creates out of that R&D some kind of a product or invention. Then the income that it generates from that product or invention can qualify for the reduced 10% rate, although there are you would have to do a very, very careful analysis and meet certain conditions. Final point to note is compliance-wise, and Aidan touched on it, the filing date for corporation tax returns is 9 months after the year end. Now, given that a lot of Irish companies have 31 December year ends, we're currently very busy in our office, as you can imagine, because the deadline for those companies to file their corporation tax is the 23rd of September, which is only 3 weeks away or less. So we're all very, very busy in the Dublin office at the moment.
Michael, could I ask or repeat the two issues? Pillar 2, 15% is where Irish company is the holding for some other, say, offshore company which do not have a sufficient tax burden. Correct? It is these rules you mean?
Yes, well, the key thing, Dimitro, is that the turnover is more than 750 million euro per annum. But when they look at that, because they also look at connected companies and group companies, just because the Irish company itself might have a much lower turnover doesn't mean that it won't apply. They will also look at the turnover of the group as a whole. And yes, once that goes above the 750 million, then it has to pay this top-up tax, which means that effectively the corporation tax rate is 15% for that company. Correct.
Understand. And please repeat the types of non-trading income types, for example.
Yes, so the types of non-trading income typically are the rental income, interest income, and dividend income as well, although as we'll see in a minute, there are special rules for dividend, but they are your three main categories of non-trading income. But we mentioned patents as well. In some cases, patents, if you're not actually actively managing the patent, if it's just simply leased to somebody, that might in some cases be called passive income, which might also fall under the 25%.
So passive income.
Yeah.
Understand. Я переведу. Значит, ну, как обычно, налогооблагается прибыль, получаемая отовсюду, но для филиалов только прибыль, сгенерированная от работы в Ирландии. Налоговый период, точнее, предельный срок до сдачи налоговой отчетности 9 месяцев после окончания года, уже об этом говорил нам Эйден, у Майкла здесь это подчеркнуто. И дальше у них с 1 января 2024 года введен так называемый Пилар 2, который требует налогообложения для больших групп, ну, когда все компании группы, их общий объем превышает 700 миллионов, сравнивается налоговая нагрузка в разных странах с 15% нормой. Ну, то есть если Profit Generation Centers находятся там в офшорах и не доплачивают налоги, то Ирландия их может взять. Такое правило. Вот. И 3 вида ставок, то есть мы видим для торговых компаний 12,5%, для компаний, получающих пассивные доходы, дивиденды, роялти, проценты, повышенная ставка 25%, но есть кое-какие исключения, о них будем говорить. И патентные доходы от патентов ставка 10%, но, как я понял, тут разница между роялти и доходом от патента в том, что патентный доход, он является активным, если предприятие продолжает вкладывать и развивать соответствующие разработки. Но в этом отличие. Michael, I have translated and we can proceed. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you. So then our next topic is, sorry, slide here. Holding companies, I think, is the next. No, sorry, the slides. Yeah, so corporation tax as well. We've mentioned there all of the rates, and we've mentioned the rules around residency and when you have to file and so on. But what about the actual corporation tax computation itself? How do you arrive at the profits? Now, we mentioned earlier that in Ireland, the effective tax rate and the headline rate end up quite similar. And one of the reasons is that the accounting profit and the taxable profit, in most cases, now we can't generalize, but in most cases, will be quite similar. Now, there are certain expense items that are treated differently. Most expense items that go through the accounts are also deductible for corporation tax purposes, but there are a number that are deemed not to be wholly and exclusively for the trade and therefore cannot be deducted. And one of the most common examples of that is client entertainment. Fortunately, staff entertainment is deductible, but not the client entertainment. Also, what cannot be deducted is expenditure that is capital in nature. However, expenditure that is capital in nature might actually qualify instead for tax depreciation, which we mentioned earlier. Regarding interest, because that is one of the most important areas in, I think, in any country's tax regime, Interest in Ireland on loans that are used for the business are generally quite easily deductible. So, for example, loans used as working capital or loans used to buy stock, etc., loans used, to buy the business premises or repair the business premises, they should be deductible. What gets a little bit more complex is loans used if you're going to buy another business. There are detailed rules behind that. But broadly speaking, the actual business loans themselves, the interest should be deductible. Now, when you've then calculated your profit and paid your tax, your next step might be that you want to repatriate the profits back to the home jurisdiction. And if you were to do that, we mentioned earlier that if it's a branch, that's pretty easy. There's no withholding tax. If it's a subsidiary paying it to its parent, then there may be dividend withholding tax of 25%. However, the Irish tax regime provides an exemption from dividend withholding tax where the recipient is either a company or an individual who is resident in an EU member state or in a country with whom Ireland has a double tax agreement. There may be certification required from the recipient of their resident status, in particular if it's an individual, but it should flow freely at that point without any withholding tax. Equally, on the other side, if the Irish company is receiving dividends from its overseas subsidiaries, then the tax treatment is quite favourable as well. What happens in that case is that the dividends are taxable. Now, we saw a minute ago that dividends are taxed at 25%, but I did mention that there are exceptions. And one of the exceptions is that if the dividend can be shown to come out of trading income, then they can be taxed at a rate of 12.5%. There should also be a double tax credit available, provided that the country from which they are received is a country with whom we have a double tax agreement. And because the Irish rate tends to be lower than most countries, other countries' rates, very often you find that the credit from overseas will be sufficient to eliminate any additional tax on the dividend. So in practice, dividends brought in from overseas end up with very little tax and in many cases no Irish tax after the double tax credit is taken into account. Unfortunately, we don't have a general participation exemption for dividends. That would obviously make it even simpler still. But the good news is that in last year's budget, it was announced that a consultation process with a view to introducing this participation exemption would be held. That has proceeded, and our next budget is only 3 weeks away on the 1st of October, and we await to see if there has been any further development in that area. Thank you, Dimitra.
I would like to ask additional question as to participation exemption. You have said that no general rule. Are there any possibilities to make it available or not? No.
Yes. So participation exemption, we'll see in a minute that we have a participation exemption for capital gains tax on the sale of shares, but not for dividends at the moment. But in the government's annual budget last October 2023, they announced that they would have a consultation process with a view to introducing a participation exemption for dividends. And that consultation process is underway. We're not sure how advanced it is, but we have our next annual budget on the 1st of October, and we may get an update in that. So yes, there is a process underway to introduce a participation exemption, but it hasn't happened yet.
Окей, thanks so much. Значит, здесь приведены такие ключевые, как это у нас называется, налоговые разницы, сопутствующие корпоративному налогу. Ну, первое, да, там налоговые разницы, связанные с non-trading, с расходами, которые не связаны с ведением торгового бизнеса. Ну, наверное, то, что у нас называется, не связано с хозяйственной деятельностью, типа расходы на развлечения. То есть есть такие. Capital expenditure, да, тоже включается амортизация, не сразу попадает в расходы. По процентам по займу, он говорит, в целом то проценты по займу попадают в расходы, но есть некоторые исключения, там, например, если заем взят для приобретения другого бизнеса, для инвестиций, там может не попасть. Репатриация прибыли облагается налогом на репатриацию, есть он у них. И дальше ведет рассказ о том, как облагается по-моему, там большой налог. Michael, could I ask once again, the tax rate for repatriation of profit, 25%, correct?
So from abroad, if you repatriate, do you mean, repatriating profits to the overseas holding company? Yes. So the headline rate, Dimitri, of dividend withholding tax is 25%. But if the company to whom it is being repatriated is resident in either the EU or in a country with whom Ireland has a double tax agreement, and provided that the company is not, the other company is not controlled by Irish residents, there's actually an exemption from dividend withholding tax. So if the exemption didn't apply, it would be 25%. But by and large, if you're repatriating profits to a parent that is resident in either an EU or a double tax treaty country, there should be an exemption from that DWT.
Understand. Значит, не применяется все-таки налог на репатриацию, он у них большой, 25%. В случае, если дивиденды распределяются физическому лицу резидента Европейского Союза или страны, с которой подписано соглашение об избежании двойного налогообложения, там уже надо смотреть ставки, на которые оно уменьшается, или компаний, аналогичным образом, которые находятся на территории Европейского Союза или в стране, где есть соглашение об избежании двойного налогообложения. Значит, дивиденды, которые приходят, соответственно, в Ирландию, тоже могут облагаться по ставке 25%, но тоже надо смотреть, там могут быть вычеты вследствие уплаты налогов на территории другого государства, налога на репатриацию, которые принимаются в зачет. Но в целом дивиденды облагаются по ставке 25%, и не применяется, вот я с удивлением об этом узнал, participation exemption rule. Они только ведут консультации относительно его принятия, но есть льгота, которая касается не дивидендов, а capital gain, то есть прибыли от продажи инвестиционных активов корпоративных прав. Michael, am I understand correct that capital gain exemption is zero taxation?
Yes.
Correct? Zero
Yes.
tax. Да, то есть там полное освобождение налогом, соответственно, корпоративным, инвестиционная прибыль не облагается. Michael, thank you so much. We can proceed.
Thank you, Dimitri. So our next holding companies then. So if you set up an Irish holding company, Ireland is a well-established location for EU holding companies, mainly after a number of changes were introduced 15 to 20 years ago, to be more precise, 2004 and 2008 in particular. And the advantages of Ireland as a holding company regime are the 12.5% rate for dividends, which we've mentioned, and with the double tax credit, there's a chance that you will have very little additional tax to pay on them in practice. Hopefully, a participation exemption for dividends to come. We have obviously the double tax treaty network and the various tax credits that are available, double tax credits that are available under those treaties. And then also the capital gains tax exemption. So the capital gains tax exemption is applicable where the holding company sells shares in a company owned by it. Now, it doesn't have to be a full subsidiary. Generally speaking, it only needs to own 5% of the shares in the other company, provided the other company is either a trading company or is part of a trading group, and provided that that other company is tax resident in either another EU member state, in either Ireland or another EU member state, or a country with whom we have a double tax agreement. And once it owns at least 5% for a 12-month period, the disposal of the shares in that subsidiary should be exempt from capital gains tax. And obviously the advantage of capital gains tax exemptions and the favourable treatment of dividends is that you then have, instead of having the after-tax amounts available to reinvest in business activities, you have the entire gross amounts. So it's attractive as a holding company regime for those reasons.
Значит, да, я сейчас задам вопрос, я сначала общую информацию переведу. Значит, режим холдинговой компании, как мы уже сказали, не применяется на налог к инвестиционной прибыли. К дивидендам применяется 12,5%, вот я сейчас буду переспрашивать, бо я думал 25%. Значит, вычеты вследствие применения Конвенции об избежании двойного налогообложения, налога на репатриацию удержанного за рубежом, и 70 таких конвенций, которые позволяют вычитать. Michael, one more question from me for better understanding. For dividends, 12.5, not 25% is applied.
Correct, provided you can show that the dividend was paid out of the trading profits of the overseas subsidiary.
Да, значит, 12,5 применяется только если дочерка осуществляет активную операционную торговую, как он выражается, деятельность. А если эта деятельность не торговая, то будет 25. Вот. Здесь разобрались со второго раза. Спасибо. Michael, I have several questions for this and for the previous slides. For previous. Are there any requirements for parent company from European Community to apply zero VAT on dividends?
Okay.
When dividends are out coming from Ireland.
From Ireland. Okay. So there are two scenarios there, Dimitro. If the company is actually a parent, in other words, it controls more than 50%, so it's actually its actual parent, then there is no requirement to get a certificate. There's just a general exemption from dividend withholding tax on that. If the company that is receiving the dividend doesn't have a majority share, then that other company must complete a declaration that it is resident in whatever country it's resident in and give it to the paying company, to the Irish company. But it doesn't need to get it certified by their own revenue commissioners necessarily. And finally, if you're paying a dividend to an individual in another EU member state, I know that's slightly different, but in that case, the individual has to get a certificate from their own revenue commissioner, their own tax authority, to state that they are resident in that country. But for companies, essentially, if it's to a parent, no. But if it's to a minority shareholder, they just need the declaration from the company.
Understand. And as well, regarding U.S. company, whether a U.S. company can enjoy zero VAT tax in Ireland when the Irish company pay dividends to U.S. parent company, United States.
Yes, it should be able to get that because, again, we have a double taxation agreement with the US, and therefore, provided the US company gives the certificate, or if it's its parent, it doesn't need the certificate, then it should be in a position to pay it. Unless the US company is in turn controlled by Irish residents, which would be a bit of anti-avoidance, but generally speaking, it should be a zero rate to the US as well, yes.
Okay, so zero rate unless it is controlled by Irish citizens.
Yes, yes. But in most cases, I think that wouldn't be the case.
Значит, отвечаю на вопросы. Значит, если компания из Европы, вот такой вопрос, материнская, значит, если это реально материнская компания, то есть контролирует больше, чем 50% акций ирландской компании, то льгота 0% автоматически, даже не нужен сертификат резидентности. Если там меньше 25% или контроль не компании, а физическим лицом, то по предъявлению сертификата резидентности применяется нулевая ставка налога. И, в принципе, похожая ситуация с Соединенными Штатами Америки. То есть в силу того, что есть конвенция, применяется нулевая ставка налога, исключение, если за американской компанией стоит ирландский гражданин. Ну, у нас похожие правила начали вводиться. And one more question, Michael. Is this capital gains exemption also applied to the selling of the property of the company? In case buying and selling of property is company main business activity?
No, that's an important point, Dimitra. So one of the conditions is that the company being sold the shares that are being sold must be in a company that is wholly or mainly a trading company, or that the group as a whole is a trading company. But also there's a second condition there that says that if the majority of the value of the company being sold is derived from Irish property, then the exemption will not apply to that sale at all. So and that's the case even if the property that's owned by the subsidiary is property that's used elsewhere in the group. So if you sell shares that derive the majority of their value from Irish land and buildings, the exemption will not apply.
Thanks so much. Значит, не применяется это правило по продаже инвестиционных активов, если вы, например, там продаете здание, находящееся в Ирландии. Ну, это считается торговой деятельностью, ну и применяются общие правила для торговой компании. Thanks so much, Michael. We can proceed.
Thank you, Ruth. So our next slide, we're going to just have a quick look at a case study. Just to illustrate the points we've made there. So we've got an Irish software development company. So this is a company we're saying whose trade is actually developing software, and it's actively doing it all the time. So when it develops that software and it licenses it out, that should be treated as trading income. It's not passive in this case because they've actually been involved in its development and management of it and so on. It's their main trade. So they would pay the 12.5% rate. But they might qualify for the knowledge development box. And if they do, then the reduced rate of 10% may apply. And what they would need to do in order to claim for the knowledge development box, or rather the major thing that they would have to do, is to illustrate that they developed that software using research and development carried on in Ireland. And for research and development, we mean research and development as defined for the R&D tax credit. So there's a good possibility that this company might have qualified for the 30% credit as well while it was developing the software. The definition of R&D for the R&D credit, it is a little bit complex. It's based on science and so on, but it talks about resolving a scientific or technological uncertainty or trying to make a scientific or technological breakthrough. And things like software development very often qualify, although you'd need to look on a case-by-case basis. So it might have qualified for the R&D credit, and if it did, then it is possible that any income, and it developed a product, which is the software, it may be in a position in respect only of any income derived from the usage of that product, so the licensing of the software, it may qualify for the knowledge development box and a reduced rate of 10%. Now, the rate on the rate involved here either way it's quite good. It's either 10% or it's 12.5%. And then it turns around and pays the dividend back to its US parent. And because we have a double tax treaty with the United States, the payment of the dividend should be exempt from dividend withholding tax, and then it lands back in the United States. So by the time the profits are back in the United States, the total amount of Irish tax suffered should only be somewhere between 10 and 12.5%.
Thanks so much. Ну, здесь приведен конкретный кейс, который нам в порядке подготовки к семинару слала аудитория, участники веба, о том, что, например, IT-компания учреждена штатами и собирает роялти от своих разработок. Сколько налогов будет платиться? Ну, базово 12,5%. Corporation Tax, можно в силу вычета сократить налоговую нагрузку до 10%, если впишемся в Knowledge Development Box, который существует в Ирландии. Я сейчас условия пересказывать не буду, но надо в них разбираться. Да? И, наконец, при выплате дивидендов в Штаты будет применяться полное освобождение от налогов. Тобто, нагрузка будет колебаться от 10 до 12,5% в зависимости от того, насколько угадаем с льготой. Thank you so much, Michael. We can proceed.
Thank you, Ruth. So, our next slide that we're looking at, so that's the corporate tax. The second area that we said would be important for anyone looking to set up an Irish business is transfer pricing. And Ireland has introduced transfer pricing rules just a couple of years ago, and there are, I guess, two parts to the transfer pricing regime. There's the actual pricing, so the requirement that transactions between your group companies or connected parties and so on should be on an arm's length basis. And if they're not, then there can be a transfer pricing adjustment enforced in both companies. The second part is the documentation requirement, and this is whether the business is required to maintain a master file or a local file detailing how they've come to the pricing decisions that they have on the relevant transactions. Now, the good news is that there is currently an exemption from the transfer pricing rules for SMEs, for small and medium enterprises. And you will see on the slide there what the definition of SME for those purposes is. Broadly speaking, it's a business with less than 250 employees and either an annual turnover of less than 50 million euro or gross assets of less than 43 million. But be careful, because if it's part of a group or of connected entities, you may have to look at the total turnover of the group with a view to establishing if you're an SME or not. If you're an SME, you're currently not impacted by the rules, but there is a proposal to extend transfer pricing rules to SMEs. And in fact, the legislation to do so has already been enacted in 2020, but it will not become live or into force until there is a ministerial order signed by the Minister for Finance, which hasn't happened yet. The good news is, though, when that eventually does happen and transfer pricing is extended to SMEs, the documentary requirements for SMEs will be much lighter than for those bigger businesses.
So at now, small and medium business, two criteria from three at this table is exempt from the requirements of transfer pricing documentation, correct?
Yes, correct, yes.
But certain adjustments are ahead.
Correct. Although, Dimitri, even leaving aside transfer pricing, there are obviously more general in the Irish tax legislation for many years. There are certain anti-avoidance rules that, you know, if connected parties are trying to avoid tax, for example. But the transfer pricing, that's correct. It doesn't apply to SMEs at the moment, but it's expected that it will in due course. Yeah.
Thanks so much. Ну, этот слайд посвящен трансферному ценообразованию, так бичу современного международного налогообложения. Ну и вот хорошая новость от Майкла в том, что Ирландия не применяет правила трансферного ценообразования сейчас для малых и средних компаний, ну, для микро, само собой. Критерии малых и средних у вас на экране, ну, там прям нормально. И, ну, соответственно, можно жить, да, то есть не сильно вдаваясь в проблемы ТЦО и возможно для начисления. Правда, Майкл говорит, что сейчас проводятся консультации, чтобы все-таки ввести, но и в этом случае требования к документации будут мягче, чем для, ну, так называемых больших предприятий. Michael, thank you so much, and we have another one question dedicated to corporate profit tax. Irish-Ukrainian partnership in fisheries, namely Ukrainian mother vessel, take and process fish caught in the Irish waters by the local fishermen. What tax regime may be expected?
Well, it depends on the structure that they use. So if they use a company to do that, and if the company is, well, if the company is Irish resident, it's certainly subject to corporation tax because of worldwide income. But even if it's not resident and it's processing the fish in Ireland, then it's likely that Irish corporation tax would apply. Now, also, the definition of Ireland extends to cover things like the Irish continental shelf. So some of the seawaters, for example, around Ireland are actually treated as part of Ireland. So the trade is being carried on there. So I would think it is likely that Irish corporation tax would apply in that case. And that should be a 12.5% rate. There are certain types of trades, Dimitro, that don't qualify for the 12.5%. They're actually at 25%. But they would be trades like, you know, mineral exploration or extracting your mining activity and that type of thing, or certain types of land dealing, but they're kind of specialist areas. But I think the processing of fish should be a 12.5% trade.
Understand. And if non-resident Valentin?
So if it's a non-resident company, then it should only be liable to Irish corporation tax on the Irish activity, which, assuming that the catching and processing of fish would be taking place in Irish waters and on Irish soil, would be the profit derived from that activity.
Derived from what? They didn't hear.
So if they're I think what they're saying there is that the fish are caught in Irish waters, and that and then it's processed while they're in Ireland and so on, and then I presume they sell it on from there. Then any profits generated on that would be subject to Irish corporation tax.
Would be subject to Irish corporation tax.
Yes.
Ну, пока общий ответ, резидент, не резидент, но если это в ирландских водах, то он будет подлежать ирландскому налогообложению или 12,5%, или может быть даже 25%, как налог на эксплуатацию, ну, как природных ресурсов, ну, типа вы из шахты добываете, ну, разновидность пассивного дохода. Специфический вопрос, я на нем не заостряюсь. Валентин, спасибо, но я надеюсь, вы ответ получили. Michael, thank you so much.
Okay. One other point on that, Dimitro, because I know it's mentioned, I think you said it's a partnership between Ireland and the Ukraine. Obviously, if somebody was doing something like that, because you have people from the two different jurisdictions involved, you would want to look very carefully in advance as to what actually the best structure to use is, because you've obviously got Ukrainian tax and Irish tax and so on, you know. So it would be important to look at the structure, obviously, in advance.
Ну, совет Валентину подумать о структурировании по партнерству может быть tricky. Yes, Michael, we can proceed.
Thank you, Dimitri. So then VAT is our next tax, and I'm sure people are familiar with VAT. It's an EU-wide sales tax, effectively. And in Ireland, the requirement to register for VAT arises where if in a 12-month period you expect to make at least €40,000 of services sold or €80,000 of goods sold. And obviously when we say goods and services sold here, we're talking about VATable goods and services, because some goods and services are exempt from VAT. You know, medical services, for example, or, you know, things like that are potentially exempt. So it's only if they're VATable, and if you're going to exceed that 40 or 80,000 threshold, then you would need to register and start accounting for Irish VAT on those sales. And it's important to note, it's not the point at which you go above the 40 or the 80,000 that you register. It's at the point where you become aware that you are likely to have more than that level of sales in a 12-month period. 40,000 for services, 80,000 for goods. And if you're doing both goods and services, it's the lower of the two, the 40,000 that applies. The rate of VAT in Ireland, the headline rate or the standard rate, is 23%, which is probably one of the higher rates in Europe. However, Ireland has a lot of goods and services, more than most European countries, at which reduced rates apply. And the reduced rates are typically 13.5%, or in a small number of cases, 9%. And we also indeed have quite a number of goods and services, such as, for example, food and certain basic clothing, that is zero rated, or indeed in some cases VAT exempt. Now, if you are registered for Irish VAT, you have to file your VAT returns. Normally, it's every 2 months, January, February, March, April, etc., and you file them on the 23rd day of the month after the end of the period. So, for example, this month, the 23rd of September, we'll be filing a lot of July, August VAT returns. For sales that are being made currently in September, they will fall into the September, October return, which is due on the 23rd of November. Typically, businesses that are accounting for VAT on sales will also be entitled to recover the VAT on the purchases that they incur in making those sales, so the input VAT, and then they pay over the net to the revenue on the 23rd of the month. Okay.
Please bring examples of the goods or services subject to reduced rate, one and second.
So, for example, a tourist type activity, so hotel accommodation, restaurants, etc., they're taxed at 13.5%. Electricity bills are normally taxed at 13.5%, but because of the inflation of the last 2 years, the government have temporarily reduced them to 9%. So that would be an example of the 9% rate. For a long number of years, hotel accommodation and restaurants had been reduced to 9%, but it was brought back to 13.5% a couple of years ago. But certain types of adventure activities, like kayaking and, water sports and that actually still have the 9% rate.
Yes.
But I guess they would be the main types that are at those levels. But there are actually quite a lot of them.
Okay.
Okay. So
I'm translating. Or you still speak? Окей. Значит, по НДС базовая ставка 23%. Есть довольно широкий круг льгот, пониженных ставок налога. И вот я спрашивал, какие примеры, он говорит, примеров много, да, то есть отельные услуги, туристические услуги, даже говорит, вот счета за электричество. У нас шли поставки 13,5%, но потом, ввиду того, что повысилась инфляция, правительство решило сократить ставку налога до 9%, и это, оказывается, тоже является инструментом борьбы с инфляцией. Ну и существует ряд товаров, которые или по нулевой ставке, или не облагаются, как я услышал, типа еды. Значит, пороги для регистрации плательщика в НДС, как и в Украине, берется отрезок 12 месяцев. Для товаров порог для обязательной регистрации 80 тысяч евро. 80 на 4 – это 3 миллиона 200. Видите, у нас 1 миллион. Давно уже ходит предложение повысить до 3. Для услуг 40 тысяч евро, это получается 1 600 000 гривен. Период, как правило, месячный. В принципе, в Украине тоже в большинстве ситуаций месячный налоговый период. И срок подачи отчета и уплаты в бюджет 23 число после следующего месяца. Mike, thank you so much. We can proceed.
And then I think the last point that I'm covering is the fourth point, the individual taxes. Now, in Ireland, it's probably fair to say that the tax rates for individual are probably quite high. For lower earners, they're very fair. The rates are quite low, and they pay only a small amount of tax. But the problem is at middle income level and above, the marginal rate of tax is quite high. So once you go above 42,000 euro, which is broadly similar to the average industrial wage in Ireland, once you go above that level, but when you include national insurance and levies, the rate on the income above that can be as much as 52%. However, if there are reliefs there for people who are seconded or relocated from overseas to work in Ireland, this is an incentive known as SARP. And the way SARP works is that if an individual who is not Irish resident is posted to Ireland to take up employment here, so this would be, for example, a multinational might decide to send somebody to work for their Irish operation, then if that person is earning at least 100,000 euro, they get an exclusion from Irish income tax on 30% of the element of income that exceeds 100,000. And the key thing with SARP is, or one of the key points is that if you want to avail of that incentive, it is important that you consider and review and ensure that you meet the conditions for it before the person moves to Ireland. Because one of the difficulties we've seen people run into is people who locate to Ireland and then apply for the SARP. And at that point, they're already in Ireland and they fail one or two of the conditions. So it's important to plan carefully in advance for that. And that may be important for global businesses that are sending some of their staff to work in Ireland. More generally in Ireland, the key concepts are, I suppose, residence and payroll taxes. An individual is tax resident in Ireland if they are present here for 183 days in the current year, or for a combined 280 days last year and this year together. If they are resident in Ireland, they are taxed on their worldwide income, although of course double tax treaties might give them tax credits for foreign taxes. But even if they are not resident here, then they may still be subject to payroll taxes on their salary if they perform the duties of the employment while in Ireland. Typically, it's only if they spend less than 30 days in Ireland that they don't have payroll taxes. So somebody could find themselves in a position where they are not resident and ultimately not subject to Irish income tax, but where they have to suffer payroll taxes on their salary in the meantime and claim them back at year end. There are even some occasional cases where the individual might be suffering payroll taxes in both countries at the same time. And in that case, you may have to apply for revenue in order to get a double tax credit on an ongoing basis, because it could cause all sorts of cash flow problems for the employee, obviously. National insurance is something to be careful about. I mentioned a minute ago that tax rates in Ireland are quite high once you go above the average industrial wage. The national insurance, or PRSI as we call it, by European standards is not that high. It's only 4% on an individual and just over 11% for employers, which actually compares favourably to a lot of continental European countries. Now, a key point, of course, to bear in mind is that with national insurance globally, if somebody is relocated to another country on a temporary basis and they intend to return to their home country, and in particular if that's likely to happen within 2 years, it is likely that the national insurance that will apply is the national insurance in their home country, and not in the country of employer. So somebody who is seconded to work in Ireland on a temporary basis might not have Irish national insurance, but the employer might have to apply the foreign national insurance. But it is important that that's looked at carefully, and that the relevant, you may have to get coverage certificates and so on from the local authorities to do that. Another area, obviously, that you will look at when you're seconding or relocating employees is the whole area of visas and work permits. Now, obviously, within the European Union, there is free movement of labour and free movement of people within the EU. So typically, there won't be a requirement to get those work permits. Small point to note that possibly employees who are relocated from the UK, if they're not if they're from other European countries that come via the UK, there may be certain documentation to comply with because of Brexit. But broadly speaking, no work permits for movement within the EU. But obviously, if they're coming into the EU from outside, then there may be a requirement to apply for some form of work permit. So, Dimitro, if you'd...
Michael, I didn't catch the general rate of taxation, individual taxation, and the rate where the SAPRA is applied.
Okay, so Dimitro, the rate of income tax in Ireland is the high rate. The rates are 20% and 40%. But the point is there are some levies and national insurance as well. So for somebody who earns more than €42,000, they start paying the high rate of tax. And they might end up paying a rate of tax as high as 52%. It's actually about 48.5% at 42,000, and then it goes to 52% above 70,000. But you can see the point that once you go above 42,000, the marginal rate of tax is about half of your of the income,
Окей. Ставки налогообложения так, не маленькие, да, то есть от 20 до 40%, ну, то есть они в брекеты в зависимости от порогов применения. Поэтому, ну, в зависимости от доходности гражданина, они, ну, применяются, да, определенные. Michael, the essence of SAPRA, once again, could you repeat the essence?
So SARP is where an employer sends an employee from overseas to work in Ireland, and that employee has a salary of more than €100,000 per annum. If SARP applies, then 30% of the element of salary above 100,000 is not subject to Irish tax. It's excluded from the calculation.
33.3.
Yeah, no, 30.
30.
30, yeah.
Thanks so much. Да, есть льгота, называемая САПРА, это когда перемещается работник из-за рубежа в Ирландию, и тогда к ставкам применяется 30% скидка. Налоги уплачиваются у источника, но у нас то же самое. Хотя, безусловно, страна резиденции является ключевым критерием для обложения индивидуальными налогами. А благодаря тому, что Ирландия в Европе, ну, для тех, которые в европейском сообществе свободное движение людей и ресурсов, поэтому для них не требуется получение разрешений. Thank you so much, Michael. We can proceed.
Thank you, Dmitro. And I think to summarize on that, Aidan, you've covered quite a number of points there earlier in terms of the benefits of the Irish regime. And we've seen the tax elements there. And I think if you want to summarize, we've had the attractiveness of Ireland as a location.
Thanks, Michael. Yeah, I mean, you've kind of spoken really about Ireland being a stable place to do business. The evidence is there in terms of the number of multinational companies that have a presence in Ireland, and how many people living in Ireland are working for those companies, and how important they are to the Irish economy, and the value that the Irish economy places on multinational investment and looks after it and makes sure that that the conditions for it to thrive are there. And Michael's gone through a lot of the tax points there, a lot of the incentives around repatriation of profits and corporate tax rates, and particular grants for R&D and things like that. Executive employees coming into the country at favourable tax rates are all very, very positive aspects of what make Ireland attractive. And I think just on the slide here, just wanted to summarise all of that in one go. Dmitry, I'll hand to you.
Да, коллеги, здесь summary, собственно, что вот эти преимущества налоговые дают. Наверное, довольно, кроме там доступа на рынке, это как критерий успешности ирландской налоговой системы, что 1800 международных компаний здесь засетапились и работают. Aidan, thank you so much. I translated in short. You can proceed.
Great. Well, I think that brings us to pretty much to the end. This is about the global network. Do you want to take this, Dmitro, or will I take it?
Здесь содержится информация о Crowe глобально. 40 тысяч специалистов во всем мире, 809 офисов в 145 странах. Yes, you can proceed.
Great. Okay. And finally, just a thank you from myself and Michael for listening to us today. We hope you found it informative. And if you have any questions, of course, please feel free to reach out to us. We'd be more than happy to help you out.
Aidan and Michael, thank you so much for your speech. It was a really prolific webinar. It took 2.5 hours of your valuable time, but really we have had lots of questions. It means that Ireland is very interesting for our audience. Thank you once again, and I hope we will address our questions and clients to you soon.
Thank you, Dmitry.
Fantastic. Thank you very much. All the best. Keep safe, everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.